Hello, it's June 27th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have senior editor and journalist Nadda Osman.
Hello.
And Opinions Editor Benjamin Ashraf.
Hello.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of the news. On with the show. I'm going to kick things off this week. On Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that the, quote, intense phase of fighting against Hamas is about to end. While providing few details, he did add that it did not mean that they would end the war. Also this week, the Israeli High Court ruled that ultra-Orthodox men would no longer be exempt from military service, putting further pressure on Netanyahu, whose government is reliant on ultra-Orthodox parties. It was a ruling that many in Israeli society welcomed.
Is that the Haredi people, they should come to the army. We really like them to be there, but it should go in a peace way. Like they need to want it for themselves, and you can't make anyone to do something that is really don't wants to do.
So what do you think Netanyahu means by saying that the intense phase of fighting against Hamas is about to come to an end?
So this was specifically in reference to Rafah. This isn't a Gaza thing. He was talking about Rafah. They obviously went into Rafah early May, into the southern city, seized the very important Rafah border crossing, still shut. What does he mean when he says this? Great question, Ben. Who knows? I mean, it's all a matter of perspective, right? Ground troops in Rafah are likely to stay. They're not going to go anywhere. Aerial attacks, they're likely to stay. Artillery attacks, they'll probably continue. So if we say that it's going to become less intense in Gaza, the fighting, and yet there's still going to be aerial bombardments and there's still going to be ground forces and still going to be tanks there, if that's less intense, it's still a living hell for the people of Gaza and for the people of Rafah. So, intensity is very much a matter of perspective. In the same interview, he did talk about, the ceasefire that's been touted around recently. The US seemed very keen on calling it, the Israeli ceasefire plan. That's a different debate. He did reference that. He said that, they would be willing to accept a quote-unquote partial ceasefire, but only a ceasefire deal that would not end the war.
So it seems a bit like political speak, really, to the Americans to say, well, that we will kind of slow down or move our war into a low-intensity warfare instead, on the ground it's staying the same. Yeah,
I think it is words of appeasement for the Americans, right. I think. One interesting thing, he made these comments on a TV interview with Israeli state media. This is his first interview on Israeli state media since October 7th.
Wow.
Yeah, this is the first time he's done it, which I think is an interesting point. So
has he said anything about future military plans?
We spoke about this last week on the podcast. It's much the same, really, in the sense that eyes are sort of drifting northwards now and looking at the border with Lebanon. Netanyahu, he did say, quote, after the end of the intense phase, we'll be able to redeploy some forces to the north, and we will do that primarily for defensive purposes, but also to bring the displaced residents back home. This week and also last week, for those who sort of follow these things, you've seen videos of columns of military vehicles, including tanks and things, heading towards the north. I mean, he says that they're there for defensive purposes. Well, he can say that, can't he? Doesn't mean it's true. They could very well be preparing the ground for a ground invasion of Lebanon, of southern Lebanon. What southern Lebanon is in the eyes of Israel is debatable, but let's see. So who knows, really?
And just talking about the kind of conscription, I know you mentioned at the beginning, the new controversial bill that's saying that Haredi males are now no longer exempt from the Israeli military. So, just talk to me a bit about this new ruling, and as you said, now that the Israelis are moving northwards, is that going to have any impact?
Well, the ruling was made on Tuesday. It was the Israeli High Court who made the ruling. They began hearings on this issue at the beginning of the month, beginning of June. For context, for people who are not up on military service in Israel, they have it. All Israelis are bound by law to serve in the military from the age of 18, and they have to serve between 24 and 32 months. Previously, Haredi Jews had been exempt from military service. Tuesday's ruling says that is no longer the case.
That's quite a big thing, isn't it?
It is quite a big thing. If you're out there wondering who and what are Haredi Jews, they are a highly conservative group, Jewish group in Israel. They form around 12% of the population, so not insignificant. Not a majority, but not an insignificant amount. Most of them lead lives sort of that are strictly according to the laws of the Torah. They have their own schools and newspapers. The neighborhoods are segregated. Many are students at Jewish seminaries and sort of devote themselves to religious studies. This is sort of the crux of their exemption, is that they wouldn't serve in the Israeli military because they were religious students. Now, critics of this say that actually, in reality, many of them have dropped out of studies and are not religious scholars and not active students. They are, the critics would say, they are in fact living off the state and or off their families.
So on that point, how do Palestinians feel about this? Because I know that they pay very high taxes. They benefit very, very little from them. Meanwhile, there's an entire community who simply are not working and are not serving in the army.
So it's in the Venn diagram of Palestinian views and Israeli views, this is sort of where they cross over, actually, because, obviously Palestinians pay taxes and these Haredi Jews don't pay taxes and they don't have to do military service, and they obviously find that very frustrating, because why should they pay taxes if these people, why these Haredi Jews not have to pay taxes when they do? Israelis feel exactly the same. Particularly amongst secular Israelis, they feel that, these ultra-Orthodox, these educational facilities are paid for and funded by the state. They are reliant on taxpayer money. So there's a real irritation, I would say, amongst Palestinians, but also amongst, secular Israeli society to say, why are we supporting these people? I think where the Palestinian views, obviously where Palestinian views and Israeli views differ on this, is I think there's a view amongst Israeli society, particularly at the moment, when they feel that they are sending their sons and daughters to fight in Gaza, and these Haredi Jews are not sort of offering up the same personal sacrifice that they are, right? That I think is an intensely is an added sort of emotional intensity to this whole thing. This whole issue of Haredi exemption is something that's been growing for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. So what does this mean now? Are they all going to be in the army?
It's worth pointing, actually, just on a quick point, that some of them actually do serve, right? They serve specifically in something called the Netza Yehuda Battalion, which is specifically for ultra-Orthodox soldiers. They operate separately to the rest of the army. They have, their own special dietary and religious requirements are sort of adhered to. They don't have women in their military bases and things like this. They've also been linked to severe abuses against Palestinians. A lot of the people within these units are either formerly or currently also members of the Hilltop Youth Group, who are an extremist settler organization who have been known to commit abuses in the West Bank. In April, actually, this year, the US was set to blacklist and sanction the Netzer Yehuda battalion because of their abuse, their known abuses. That, in the end, didn't happen. In terms of whether, we're now going to get an influx of Haredi Jews into the Israeli military, the Israeli Attorney General has ordered the preliminary enlistment of 3,000 of these religious students. That number could increase in the future. It remains unclear currently if the Israeli state is going to forcibly press gang these people into the military or not, which would be quite a significant step. What they have said that is if these Haredi Jews refuse the call to sign up and to serve military service, they will no longer be eligible to receive government funding for their religious studies or whatnot. Predictably, the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel has reacted extremely badly to this. Arya Deri, who's the head of the ultra-Orthodox Shas party, he said that the Torah is Israel's, quote, secret weapon against all enemies, and, quote, no power in the world can stop Jews from studying it. One Haredi newspaper described it as a declaration of war against their community. A member of Netanyahu's cabinet, head of the United Torah Judaism Party, and also the housing minister, he condemned it, saying it was an unexpected and very unfortunate and disappointing decision. He said, quote, the state of Israel was founded in order to be the home of the Jewish people for whom the Torah is its bedrock. The Holy Torah will be victorious. He said that on X.
Just on that point, as you said, there are ultra-religious nationalists in Netanyahu's cabinet. The war cabinet has recently been dissolved, which included people like Benny Gantz. Yeah. And so you've got figures there that are, not only Israeli but Jewish nationalists. And so they conflate their Israeli nationalism with Judaism in a way that others may not, and they're more focused on Israeli nationalism. So, how are they reacting? How are the Smotrichs of this world? How are the Ben Gvirs of this world reacting? And what does this actually mean for his coalition?
The likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, I think particularly Ben Gvir, do not get along with the Orthodox. I mean, Ben Gvir is, and Smotrich both want war. They like the war that's happening at the moment, and they want more war. For more war, you need more soldiers. So they want more people in the army. In terms of the cabinet, Netanyahu's cabinet, there are two pillars essentially holding up the whole thing, really, which is on the one hand, the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches, and on the other hand is the ultra-Orthodox. And if you take one of them away, it will collapse, right? So Netanyahu does have quite a serious problem. I say that the two ultra-Orthodox parties by name are the United Torah Judaism Party and the Shas Party. On their own, right, Netanyahu could probably deal with one pillar or the other. He could, work with the Orthodox and probably get this through and make it work and, find some sort of compromise with them and, blah, 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 blah.
Then he'd have the others to deal with as well.
But he's also currently got the others to deal with as well.
Who are kind of kingmakers at the moment.
Who are kingmakers. Well, now these ultra-Orthodox people also find themselves in a bit of a kingmaker situation as well.
So what does that actually mean for
king
its,
killer, they could bring the whole thing down.
So what do you reckon about the coalition then? What you're saying is pretty severe. If you've got these two pillars, and Netanyahu's already facing huge international condemnation. You've got hawks on one side, and then people with religious considerations, but themselves, as you said, have committed atrocities in Gaza and in the West Bank. So he's kind of surrounded by all sides. So what do you reckon is going to happen next?
Netanyahu is now if he wasn't already before, he is the definition of embattled. I think.
Yeah.
I think Netanyahu actually, it might not actually be up to him, right? It's actually, I think it'll be up to the ultra-Orthodox about what they want to do on this. right? I think there is a risk for them that they can work with Netanyahu. He will probably give them whatever they want, as much as he can, to keep them on side. If they say, you're not giving us what we want, we're out, the coalition collapses, that means Netanyahu will be gone. What comes next could be worse for the ultra-Orthodox. There are many in the Knesset who do not like the ultra-Orthodox and have it out for them a lot more. One particular person, Avigdor Lieberman, he is, if analysis and sort of polling is to be believed, he is the rising star, although he's a fair old age now, and an old hand in the Knesset. He is the rising star of the right, should Netanyahu go. He does not like the ultra-Orthodox at all. So if they can stick with Netanyahu, who may force them to go into the military, or force, let's say, their children to go into the military, or they can bring down the whole thing, but that does open up the door to people like Lieberman, who will not be willing to compromise with them at all. So it could, for them, it might be a case of better the devil you know. Second story, that's you, Nadda.
Egypt is currently going through its second summer of power cuts, with scheduled outages beginning to stir discontent amidst citizens. Some are going 12 hours without electricity. With natural gas supplies dwindling and temperatures soaring, many Egyptians are struggling to carry out everyday tasks. We're speaking about a total of $1.18 billion that we will allocate as a state to pass the summertime in the coming period. This is equivalent to 57 billion Egyptian pounds. But we want the citizens to know that the amount is in dollars, and it's the important figure which we will use our dollar resources to make available throughout this very important phase. That was Egypt's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli speaking.
Power problems. What are the power problems? What's been going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a pretty hot week here in London, but in Egypt, people are quite literally dying. So in short, the issue is load shedding, and this is linked to falling gas production and overconsumption, because obviously Egypt is going through a heat wave at the moment. Now, the government has in recent weeks been extending these daily power cuts. They say it's around 3 hours per day, and in some areas longer. But realistically, in some areas, it's going up to 12 hours a day without electricity. Ooh. Now, this is quite serious. Like I said, people are quite literally dying. Earlier this month, 40 people died in Aswan, which is in the south. And Egypt needs to import around $1.18 billion worth of fuel oil and natural gas to end these power cuts. So it is a big issue. The other issue here is that they're very hard to predict. Now, people are struggling to plan their lives around these because they happen at different times. And what we're seeing, which is quite unusual in Egypt, given the current government, is people are starting to vent their frustrations on social media. So apps like TikTok and X, people are saying that they're getting stuck in elevators or they can't use their aircon. And it does impact your quality of life if you think about it. Like even small trivial things like charging your phone or like blow drying your hair, to even more significant things like, your appliances in your home eventually stop working.
Fridge, your food's going to go out.
Yeah, you can't freeze your food. You can't, use the fridge like you said. And now people are being forced to buy generators to cope. Now, in any other country, this might be okay, but a lot of people in Egypt, they can't really afford them, especially given the current economic crisis.
They're very expensive to run.
Yeah, it's just not feasible for, I would say, the majority of the population.
It's been affecting students, no?
Yeah, so students in Egypt, it's been a big issue for high school students who have their exams before they go into college. And there's been reports of them having to use candlelight, which is quite shocking, to be honest, in this day and age for students to be, studying for their exams. And the other thing people are being forced to do is go to cafes. Now, that's another added cost. A lot of Egyptians can't afford to be going to cafes every day, ordering things just to be able to study.
I saw some good stories about sort of I think there's been Coptic churches and things in Alexandria opening their doors for people.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a really nice story to see. It started off in Alexandria and then it spread to Cairo, where they're allowing students to use their Wi-Fi, their air-conditioned halls, and things like that. But I do want to raise one very interesting point, is that the power outages, controversially, have not affected Sahel al-Shamali, which is the north coast. Now, this is an area that's full of resorts where all of Egypt's elite and rich and all the tourists go to. Meanwhile, they have been affecting some of the poorer regional areas, Luqsor and Aswan, which are very, very hot in the south. They've even affected hospitals quite badly. Now, the Egyptian government said that their hospitals would be exempt, but some doctors have told reporters that they're having to deliver babies using the flashlight on their phone, and dialysis machines have stopped working as well. So it's quite a controversial thing that's happening right now.
Something needs to happen. What the government, they are nominally in charge. What's the solution? What do they come up with?
So the Egyptian government has said that fuel shipments should be coming in the third week of July, so in a few weeks from now, which will hopefully stop the power cuts. They've apologized to Egyptians in televised press conferences, but the issue is still persistent. And like I said, it's quite noteworthy because we're seeing people who are even pro-government, journalists and commentators, start to speak out, which again is quite unusual for Egypt.
You say they're getting in all this fuel, $1.18 billion of gas fuel. So why, I'm guessing they weren't surprised when summer arrived. It's been in the diary now for a few months that summer was going to come.
Yeah.
And I think they knew it was probably going to be hot as well. Why didn't they have the fuel already?
So Egypt has been getting the balance of fuel supply and demand wrong for years. They're simply not producing enough gas to keep their systems afloat. Now, this is combined with high inflation, a devalued currency, and a hike in domestic fuel prices. And like I mentioned before, the economic crisis is a factor as well. They recently got a $50 billion bailout to help ward off their financial issues. But, the energy shortage is just going to drain their foreign currency reserves.
I think, like all these countries, we spoke last week about the heat wave happening in Hajj in Saudi Arabia.
Correct.
People dying there. People have been dying in Egypt. As we said last week, why is this happening? Well, climate change.
Yeah.
That's the main reason why this is happening. Could we say that Egypt is prepared for, changing environments? You're laughing, Nadda. Why are you laughing?
I think this question is absolutely hilarious because it feels like the world is taking action or highlighting the climate issues, and Egypt is just going in the complete opposite direction.
It's funny, especially because of COP27 and
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
you're right.
Oh yeah,
Now,
I forgot about that.
Authorities in Egypt have recently been chopping down trees in Cairo to make way for infrastructure projects. So things like expanding roads and bridges and underpasses. And if you know Egypt or you've been there, a lot of cities already have very, very few green spaces. And now there are even less. And this could actually be violating the country's environmental laws, which state that they need to protect green spaces. But obviously, since Sisi has come into power, we've seen a lot of bridges being built in urban areas. And, in a lot of cases in Cairo, there are people who, if they stand in their balcony or at their windows, they can actually reach out and touch these underpasses and bridges, which is absolutely crazy. So I would argue, Egypt is absolutely not prepared for, a changing environment, and simply they need to be investing more in renewable energy rather than relying on exports.
Well, they're just kind of stuck, really, aren't they? Because, Egypt, like many countries in the global south, is just caring about short-term concerns of population growth. But, how is this population going to survive, 20, 30 years down the line when you're building roads and whatever for a new capital, but that capital may not exist in 20 years now.
Yeah, you're right. You mentioned two important points here, I think, is what a lot of critics are calling Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's vanity projects. So things like the new administrative capital and all these cities and resorts and whatever. And at the the same time, a major issue is the population. Egypt has a very, very large population, and it's continuing to grow. There's a huge strain on resources, all kinds of resources, but it's not being addressed in a proper and sustainable way. And we've heard in the past few years Abdel Fattah al-Sisi come out in many of his speeches and press conferences kind of almost blaming people and telling them that they need to
have less children, for example.
Exactly, like family planning. And it's ridiculous, really. Well,
especially, I mean, what you were saying beforehand about how this is affecting only one part of the country, and that the country in which they, the vanity projects that you speak of are, free from the load shedding that is affecting and killing so many Egyptians. I just want to, Nadda, just zoom out a little bit. And I know Egypt has and will continue to play an important role in Israel's occupation of Palestine and as a mediator, as a mediator in this. But I just wanted to ask: do you think that Israel's war on Gaza has had an impact at all on this energy crisis?
Yeah, it's actually had a significant impact on Egypt since they've been dependent on gas imports from Israel since 2020. And obviously, since the start of the war in October, this has been heavily interrupted. So the war started on the 7th of October. By the 9th of October, Israel temporarily shut down their production from the Tamar offshore natural gas field, which had a huge impact. And then it was stopped fully on the 29th of October. Now, the Egyptian government said that their natural gas imports dropped to zero from 800 million cubic feet per day.
Zeros, that's a small number, isn't it?
It's a very small number. So Egypt, it's gone south for Egypt, really. They've been trying to be this regional gas hub in the Eastern Mediterranean for years now, and it's proven to be too ambitious. Instead, what they've done is they've depended too much on Israeli gas imports, instead of focusing on exporting and all of that.
And that seems to be one of the key chips in Israel's hand, is that Jordan, it's not only Egypt that's dependent on Israeli gas reserves, it's other countries nearby, and so they can use that to leverage any kind of, when it comes to war on Gaza, they can say, well, look, you guys really need this gas.
It's much the same as Russia and Europe.
Well, there you go with the Black Sea, and, so it just goes to show about Nadda's point about, when you can future-proof your energy sector, you can have the chips in your hand later down the line and not be so reliant on other countries and imports.
Less short-termism from our global leaders.
Yeah.
Final story this week from you, Ben.
Yeah, so Representative Jamaal Bowmen has lost an election lost the primary in the 16th Congressional District in New York after AIPAC controversially showered money on his opponent George Latimer in a much publicised campaign. Jamaal Bowmen addressed his supporters after the loss.
We should be outraged. We should be outraged when a super PAC of dark money can spend $20 million to brainwash people into believing something that isn't true. We should be outraged about that.
Ben, Jamaal Bowmen, who is he? And if we sort of go back, how did he get elected first time round? What was his platform then?
Yeah, so Jamaal Bowman's very much like a grassroots blue-collar candidate, born and raised in the Bronx. He speaks quite a lot about it. He had a single mother, single parent household, 3 sisters. During the crack era, this is a particularly difficult time to be in New York in the 1980s. And before his career in politics, he had a 20-year and quite a famous 20-year career in education where he, was addressing very much like systematic inequalities in the public education system in New York. So both a reflection of his multicultural upbringing and understanding the barriers that affect low-income households. Just a fun fact, he founded a middle school called the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action in the Bronx, and it's now one of the top-performing schools in New York. So, he quite an esteemed background. And it's clear that when he went into politics, he kind of translated this social justice ethos and focused on social inequalities. And Yeah, I mean, you mentioned when he was first elected, it was actually a couple of weeks after George Floyd had been killed by the police.
Monumental times.
Yeah, and so it was that kind of BLM uprising throughout America. COVID had hit, so it was it's tumultuous times. And he ran on a ticket of jobs in education, not bombs in incarceration. So I guess that kind of typifies.
Catchy, that as well.
Yeah, very good. Better than education, as Tony Blair did. But, he, as I said, translated what he'd learned in education and what he'd brought as a personality into solving racial injustice, and also things that are specific to New York. For example, like the school to prison pipeline and the flawed immigration system. ICE had been a big story then. And then, as is now to some extent, he's still very much considered to be an outsider. During that 2020 campaign, he was up against a 16-term incumbent in Congress. So that was kind of, who he was up against. But just finally on his background, I think it's also important, as we'll find out later on, to put Jamaal Bowmen and his victory into some context. So you remember 2 years before, that was when the phrase "the squad" had come into play, and so that's the four, AOC, Taleb, Presley, and Omar, and they'd all, recorded big victories to reach Congress, running on what we would consider to be centre-left politics, but in America it's a bit more progressive than that. It's quite radical, in their sphere, and they'd said things that were critical of the American political establishment, and so what we should do is we should contextualize Bowman's victory within that same kind of an evolution of the victories of 2018.
Serving congressman, the district he served, where was it, and what were the demographics there?
Yeah, so Congress, or he's part of the House of Representatives. So there are 435 throughout the US, but obviously in major cities you have more of a concentration. So there's 26 in New York itself, and so he's a part of a 16th one, so kind of like a constituency. So it includes the northernmost part of the Bronx, which was the area that he was brought up in, and other areas, significant areas of New York, like Yonkers. It has, demographics, it has the largest proportion of Jamaican Americans in New York, 9%. But generally speaking, like the white ethnic group outnumbers the nearest minority by a ratio of 2-1. But that doesn't mean, there's still 20% of the district is of African American descent or heritage, and 13% is Hispanic. So there are, much like throughout New York generally, there is sizable ethnic minorities. To find out a bit more, because I know you wanted some real juicy nuggets in this. So you might remember or might know that they don't censor, in the American census, they don't ask people about their religion. It's actually quite difficult to find out the religious makeup of. However, in 2011, the Berman Jewish Data Bank had recorded that there were 82,700 Jewish people in a total of 776. So to do the maths, it's about 10%. So it's not an insignificant. It's not an insignificant. It's not significant. It's it may be significant, as we might find out, but but it is something to bear in mind given his loss and given how he lost the election.
As I understand, I'm sure you can tell me better, one of the main reasons he seemed to lose the election is he was very outspoken about Israeli action in Gaza, about how they're conducting the war, and also, perhaps in particular, the continued US support and funding of Israeli arms going to Israel. Maybe just expand, what were his views on Gaza? Yeah,
I mean, just to tie up that point about demographics, and it does, don't worry, I am bringing it into Gaza, but it was interesting during the election campaign that his opponent, George Latimer, said that as a mudslinging attempt or a way to rile him up. He said that Bowman's constituents were all from Dearborn. Now, if you know Dearborn, it's the only Arab majority city in Michigan, and so the implication being that everyone that supports Bowman is Arab, and everyone that supports and most Arabs obviously support Palestine. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say in order to feed it into Gaza. I always struggle with America, Hugo, for many reasons. But
you and me both, Ben.
But on the face of it, in America, he's seen as being quite pro-Palestinian, but others in the squad, like AOC in particular, they kind of flip-flop, and when it's expedient to support Palestine, they do so, and then they're a bit more vague and translucent when it comes to general policy. So it's very difficult to say that there is a real genuine, with the exception of Rashida and to some extent Ilhana Omar, that they have a blanket support, or they have what would be considered to be like a British in British politics, they wouldn't even be nearly as far as that. However, he has been in an American context quite good on Palestine and in Gaza. There is one exception, and that was during 2021. So just bear that in mind. So it's a year after he'd been elected, he went to Israel, and he met with then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who, again, we know what we were talking about in your segment. There are those kind of religious nationalists in Israeli politics, and so he was there to speak to him, and he was there to go on J Street, which for people that don't know is kind of like the liberal Zionist equivalent of Birthright, a public education program to kind of show the benefits of Israel. I would say that this also serves as a function of kind of a whitewashing of occupation, but that's by the by and not relevant. My general point about Gaza and Palestine and democratic candidates is that they kind of, even in these districts of safe democratic seats, they have to navigate their left-wing base, the mixed democratic districts, which, as I explained in terms of the demographics you have to face, their National Democratic Party, and then the overall American political establishment. So it's quite a few things to balance up. And so, there's very little room for nuance when it comes to Israel and Palestine in American politics. And so, when he went in 2021 to Israel, that was viewed with scrutiny, and, BDS called for him to resign and whatever. Yeah. However, jump forward to October the 7th, and he has been unprecedented in his position of support for Palestinians. You just have to take your minds back. The first maybe month after Israel, after October the 7th, and then the ground assault on Gaza, there was almost unanimous support throughout the world for Israeli military action. Yeah. And yet after 3 days or 4 days into the Israel's assault, he called for a ceasefire. Now, just put that into perspective. That's quite a stance, right?
That is early. That is one of the earliest I've heard, I think.
And so, and then just on that, he's also said that, he's even accused Israel of committing genocide. Again, that's quite a big... That's why I'm just trying to contextualize everything within the American context, because, here in Britain or across Europe, genocide is used because it's within the framework of international law. But within America, you can't really play that game. International law isn't as well respected in terms of how they see the occupation. I think, I think he's been as strong as he could be, to be honest. And so I will. It's certainly a loss for the Palestinian cause that he's now lost this election.
He's lost his primary against George Latimer chap. One of the things I'm hearing and reading about a lot is that AIPAC was partly or wholly responsible for this. AIPAC, who dat, and how much money are we talking about here? How much do they pump in?
Who aren't AIPAC is the question, Hugo.
Oh.
So, the American-Israeli... So I'll just introduce them formally, and then we'll talk about them as AIPAC. But they're called the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, and they are the largest, most significant, bipartisan, political American interest group that is part of what we would call is like the loosely kind of organized groups and individuals that would make up what we would call the Israel lobby in America. Their aim is to ensure that American foreign policy is unconditionally supportive of Israel and prevent any criticism. I was actually listening to one of those kind of not Joe Rogan type things, but like something like that. And John Mearsheimer, the realist, was on it and was describing the Israel lobby in America as being joined at the hip. So the idea is to kind of make them synonymous with one another, the values of America and the values of Israel. So the key thing about this, and this is why it's really quite an important story, is that, AIPAC is Washington's most powerful pro-Israel organization. But it had been, for decades, up until 2021, had been dedicated to lobbying and remaining largely outside of electoral campaigns, right? But as I'd said, and this is why I think Bowmen needs to be put within this context of the 2018 elections of the Squad and Bowmen and Bush and others, they decided in 2021 that they would be entering the campaign space, and so kind of blur the lines between lobbying, fundraising, and electoral intervention. And so what they did is they set up these things called political action committees. In this case, the key one is the United Democracy Project, and I will quote their website: "So that they could remain successful in an ever-changing Washington." But crucially, these political action committees, they can't contribute to politicians, but what they can do is they can solicit and spend unlimited campaign funds for or against candidates, right? They can't back them, but they can just say, we're going to spend loads of money for you,
whether you like it or not.
Whether you like it or not.
That sounds like a very healthy aspect of a good democracy.
Correct. These, and furthermore, they're largely opaque. No one really knows who funds them. They're unreported. The campaign methods are very, very deceptive. And it's important to know that these kind of there's just mainly negative ads about the opponents rather than positive for their actual or their secret candidate. Okay. And so you would see these kind of negative ad campaigns plastered across radio and TV. But most importantly, none of them actually mention Israel or Palestine. So it's normally on local issues. So trying to sow doubt, mistrust among voters.
I saw that with I saw some of the Jamaal Bowmen attack ads, and a lot of them seem to be stuff about how he didn't back Biden.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues for them was that because he was one of the people who voted against Biden's infrastructure bill. So they ran a whole load of ads saying he doesn't support the president.
Exactly.
Whereas George Latimer, he will stand by President Biden.
Yeah, so it's kind of sowing the seed of doubt within the voter. And as you said, they're almost always negative against the progressive candidate. And they're not kind of designed to persuade voters to choose the lobby's candidate. Rather, they're meant to discourage voters from choosing the the targeted one. So that's that. But then the most, I guess, what people are most interested in is the money.
Show me the money.
And so throughout this primaries campaign, AIPAC has spent $100 million on their candidates or proposed candidates. And so they're meant to. This is meant to kind of quell what they would see as the liberal rebellion in American politics, the kind of woke politics that I'm sure they're against. But also to kind of impose a pro-Israel agenda on the Democratic caucus and warn them, those that are willing to confront them just to, keep out, stay away. And on the Bowmen election itself, they spent a quarter of that, so $25 million on the Bowmen.
$25 million.
Yeah. And it's an extortionate amount, and it was even described by the American establishment outlet Axios as overkill. So if you've got Axios telling you that, and so I think there was an opinion piece of Richard Silverstein, who runs the Israeli American political blog called Tikkun Olam, and he wrote in the article that George Latimer had outspent Jamaal Bowmen 10-1, and from when the campaign started to when it finished on Tuesday, they spent $17,000 per hour. So it's amazing what money can buy.
And Ben, why are AIPAC targeting Democratic primaries?
Yeah, so it just seems like it's like a bit of a shift in strategy. So, in the past, no one really cared about primaries. They were kind of like a tiny blip on the political radar. And so the person that got the nomination, those that got the nomination usually like sail through to victory. But after, it all comes back to 2018 and just a kind of seismic shift that the Squad and then Bowmen and others kind of had. They realized that they needed to change their approach. And so, rather than shoving the money in their pockets at the general election stage, they were like, well, let's nip it in the bud. Like, let's defeat these progressive candidates in the primaries, which makes sure that which prevents them from basically having a free reign when they get to election because they're democratic safe seats. And so, this has a double effect. So it also portrays the Democratic Party as essentially one that's up for sale. So, if you're a candidate and you're like, whoa, I can see the money, I'm going to, you're still not at prominence level yet. You're still at a primary stage. So if you've got this
you haven't technically won the seat at all.
You've done very little. So there's that element of it, but also it discourages voters from turning out. So those kind of marginal seats or those marginal demographics that have been, outspent and outvoted essentially at the primary stage, they're not, when it gets to the general election stage, they're not going to bother voting because they've seen on a local level what's happened, what AIPAC or other organizations have done. They're not going to want to do that. So it's a massive, massive strategy shift. It's not looking good. As a wise man once said, it's not looking good, bruv.
Well, you mentioned the squad, Tlaib, AOC, the rest. Are they next for AIPAC, or where does AIPAC go? This seems like a pretty big win for them.
Yeah, it's huge, and they're very emboldened, and they've got their sights on Cori Bush, who is in St. Louis in Missouri, and her primary is on the 6th of August, if I'm correct. They've already spent $2.5 million on election campaigns, on ads, and that's according to Ad Impact. And that sum's expected to increase, although, New York, they spend more money than other places in America. She's already gone out Wednesday, so yesterday she went out and said that, and I quote, "These same extremists are coming to St. Louis. They are bankrolling a faux progressive former Republican campaign operative to buy out our deep blue Democratic seat. But let me be clear, St. Louis will not be silenced or sold out." And she mentioned something quite important here, actually, because as I mentioned, that PAC, so the Political Action Group, Political Action Committee, they masquerade the names, United Democratic Group or whatever, they masquerade as these essentially what sounds like democratic groups, but they're often funded by Republicans. So they're there to kind of stir the pot of discontent within the Democratic Party and kind of really pull apart the left wing. So as Cori Bush said in the statement that they are coming. They're coming to St. Louis and they will come to other places. But yes, Cori Bush is next up. And just to kind of conclude this story, we're really entering a new era of massive spending, not only in general elections, but as this story shows, but in primaries as well. And it seems like the AIPAC and other lobbies like it, they kind of have unlimited funds. They're just willing to throw money at candidates, and those candidates and those funders often donate to our right-wing billionaires and offer them many of which have donated to Donald Trump's campaign. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to make like a Democratic Party that's very pliant, very obedient, and dare I say it, a takeover of the Democratic Party itself. It's such a contrast really between like these big efforts and then the actual things that the Americans care about on the ground. You tell the person in St. Louis about the person that's funding the campaign of the person that ended up winning the election. They don't know that it's coming from AIPAC. All they care about are the bread and butter issues, and they play on it. These PACs play on the insecurities or the vulnerabilities of the electoral candidates, but also of the constituents, just to kind of make the overall party more pliable, which I think is a very, very dangerous distortion that AIPAC and others like it have introduced into American politics.
A few other stories from the week. One here. Iran's presidential election dominated by Khamenei loyalists. Iranians choose a president on Friday in a tightly controlled election following Ibrahim Raisi's death last month, with the outcome expected to influence the succession of Ayatollah al-Khamenei, Iran's top decision maker. They all seem to be pretty firmly towing Khamenei's party line. Do you think there is any hope that sort of these will be rejected by the Iranian people? A low turnout, perhaps? We had a pretty low turnout at the last local elections in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they
get-
put the reformist candidate as just as a symbolic gesture, really. I think most of the
Just for a bit of a laugh. really.
yeah, but it will be interesting to see. I think I was reading an opinion piece in Project Syndicate, and he was convinced that the reformist candidate is going to shock everyone. But I think the more rational person will assume that if the stakes are as high as selecting the next supreme leader, it's going to be very much an establishment candidate.
Yeah, I think the 2021 election when Raisi became president, that was a turnout of 49%.
Yeah, look
So
what
I do-
happened to him.
You think they're linked?
Well, that was what they were
Says
saying.
the conspiracy
Well,
theorist.
no. Well, there were apparently two in the running for it, and that was the son of the current supreme leader and Raisi, and the Game of Thrones of Iranian politics continues.
Another one, Czech Republic to lead mission to Syria to study refugee return. The Czech Republic will lead a fact-finding mission to Syria to set up, quote, safe zones to which Syrians in Europe and the Middle East would be able to return. This seems like it could set quite a dangerous precedent, I think, if the Czech Republic comes back in and says it's safe, it's an EU nation, will other EU nations then follow and start shipping Syrians back to Syria?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, human rights groups have already repeatedly been saying that Syria is not safe for refugees and asylum seekers to return back to. Some of them could be facing torture and imprisonment, many other things. So this
Forced conscription as well.
Yeah, so this doesn't sound good at all.
No, I think it's
There
quite
was
worrying.
there was a good piece written by Fadel Abdelghani, who's the head of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. He wrote a good opinion piece talking about arbitrary detention,
Yes.
and in it he describes, or he explains that there are thousands of cases of those that have gone back to Syria that have now gone missing. They're now back in this arbitrary detention, and no one knows where they are. So yeah, just if you want to know a bit more about how dangerous it is to be returning to Syria, if you've been in any way critical of them, is there is data available.
Yeah. And Trump, Biden, set for historic
Yawn.
US presidential
Yawn.
debate. Yawn. Yawn, says Ben. Ben's not going to watch. Nadda, you going to watch it?
I think I might tune in just for the laughs, to be honest. I mean, both Trump and Biden seem to be like faltering and stumbling in all of their public appearances and events. And, there's questions, not to be ageist, but about their age and how coherent they are. And it's quite funny, to be honest.
I mean, Biden's 81, Trump 70,
Not much younger.
77, I think.
Yeah.
At what point?
My favourite one of the recent.
When does this just become elder abuse?
Did you see the video of Biden disassociating?
Yeah, just staring out into the distance. He turned around, and I always feel sorry for the handlers because they've kind of always got to be like, you're live on TV.
Nudge him.
My favourite one was Trump talking about how competent he is, cognitively competent he was, and was talking about Biden, obviously, and some of his gaffes. And then he said, his doctor that did his competence test, he couldn't even remember his name. And
He got the doctor's name wrong. That was a good
Yeah, it's going to be funny,
Yeah,
I
so
think.
many.
It's going to be
I
funny.
think Nadda's just persuaded me. I'm going to watch it.
You're gonna watch it. You're gonna watch it now. There we go. It could be funny, and maybe the world will just start sweating with nerves as well. I
Yeah.
feel at the same time. We have some recommendations from the New Arabs website for our listeners to go and read. Let's start with Nadda.
So my recommendation is from the Features Desk. It's titled "The Hajj Heat Disaster Highlights the Need for Climate Change Action in Mecca." And it comes after 1,300 people died in this year's pilgrimage. And it also focuses on the shortcomings in the way that climate emergencies are managed in the Middle East. Very important topic at the moment, considering, climate change is only going to get hotter. Next year's Hajj is going to be probably higher temperatures again.
And Ben?
It's Vijay Prashad's latest op-ed in the New Arab, and it's on Julian Assange's freedom, and he tracks his own personal relationship with the WikiLeaks founder, and also has a great bit at the end where he meets one of his Iraqi friends who is a journalist and just looks at, from the perspective of Iraqis and Afghanis, the importance of Julian Assange in uncovering American war crimes during the so-called War on Terror.
Yeah. I've picked out an in-depth piece by Tara Bryan. 10 years after the Yazidi genocide, has Iraq allowed Islamic State to evade international justice? It's about the campaign, to secure justice for the Yazidi minority who was so appallingly attacked by the Islamic State in August 2014, and how both Iraq and the UN has failed to secure justice, the much-needed justice, for that group. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by Opinions Editor Benjamin Ashraf and Senior Editor and Journalist Nadda Osman. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts, and be notified for when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Until then, if you have any questions that you would like us to answer or any stories that you would like us to cover, you can drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. Or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region